It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Gideon Kossoff. I first met him in 1994 when he came to Schumacher College to take a course by a couple of weird people called John and Nancy Todd, and we became very sort of thick friends, especially when we discovered that he had been attending. This is a young man from central London who had been attending the Goddard College, the Institute for Social Ecology there in the late 80s, right up until about 1990.
Yeah.
So he in an odd way is grounded a little bit in Vermont, and so much so that I think he's planning on buying a UVM T-shirt. His early training was in history and English, which is probably a good place for everybody to start. And then he went on at Schumacher College to get a degree in holistic science, the same degree that Terry, who spoke yesterday, also does. And what's interesting, they both worked with this wonderful systems guy, Brian Goodwin, who somehow was able to inculcate into the Schumacher culture the idea of science is valuable, science is important, but it is really a springboard for finding a sort of larger amount of meaning in the world at large. And I can't think of a better place to sort of get that kind of scholarship, which then, and I should add Anthony McGinnis here too in the room, also went through the same program with the same remarkable man. It's kind of it's a little bit like was it Black Mountain College in this country? There was about a decade or 2 decades of this sort of intellectual flowering, and right at the heart of it, for so much of that was Gideon. He then went off to work on a doctorate with Seton Baxter, who was another remarkable biology, at the Center. What is the Center for the Study of Natural Design at the University of Dundee. And his talk today, am I correct in saying, is an outgrowth of that work?
Yeah, it's summarizing that work.
So this is going to be a very interesting talk.
So thanks, John, and thanks to the Gund Institute and the Rubenstein School and to Solutions Magazine for sponsoring this talk. As John said, it's particularly meaningful for me to be giving the talk here today because, in a way, the journey, the line of thinking and the line of questioning that I'm going to be talking about today, that journey began all that time ago at the Institute for Social Ecology with Murray Bookchin, who was a resident of Burlington, who died a couple of years ago, and his colleagues. So it's particularly strange and interesting for me to be giving this talk here today. So this is the question I'm really interested in. How do we get from here to there? How do we make the transition? So what I want to propose is a framework for the transition to a sustainable society, and a framework within which grassroots sustainability activists and as well as specialists in all the different fields, ecology, engineering, the arts, psychology, economics, anthropology, in which all those specialists can collaborate with grassroots sustainability activists, and a framework within which sustainability initiatives can be conceived, developed, critiqued, connected and integrated with each other into robust decentralized systems that can offer new ways of satisfying our needs on a daily basis, and that can eventually, hopefully, replace the centralized and dominating systems on which which currently preside over us, and which are largely responsible, I would argue, for our manifold ecological, social, cultural, economic crises, which now threaten to overwhelm us. So, in developing such a framework, we need to begin with everyday life. The activities and practices that are directed towards the satisfaction of human needs. It's out of everyday life that all our social and cultural and political and technological forms arise. And it's here and only here, in everyday life, that solutions will be found to the myriad interconnected problems which we live with. So there's a problem with the way we try and deal with these. In my view, there's a problem with the way we try and deal with these problems at the moment, which is mainly through the lenses of different specialisms, which don't bear any direct correspondence to how we live our everyday lives. So in a sense, the specialisms stand at arm's length. They stand removed from everyday life, and I think that's a very big problem. And Guy Debord, the situationist, argued that the modern world hides behind a development of thought based on the separation of artificial fragmentary domains so as to reject the useless and vulgar concept of everyday life. Modern society is viewed through specialised fragments that are virtually incommunicable, and so everyday life is naturally the domain of ignorance. So to do justice to the complexity and the interrelatedness of our problems and the solutions to them, we need a strategy that directly addresses everyday life in a non-fragmented or holistic way. And we need to embed a holistic framework in everyday life from within which we can systematically work towards a sustainable society. Now, holism or organicism has been used in various ways from different perspectives as part of the tradition of social critique that I've dubbed radical holism. And the radical holists were a strand of basically anti-authoritarian thinkers and activists, libertarians, anarchists, anti-authoritarian socialists, social ecologists, such as, for example, Lewis Mumford, the historian and regionalist, Jane Jacobs, economist and activist, Patrick Geddes, who was based at the University of Dundee and St Andrews, where I am, and last but not least, Murray Bookchin over here, and that's me there with a bit more hair. Anyway, the interesting thing about this tradition is that about the radical holists was that they all, in some way, referred to nature or whole systems or ecology or the organic to validate their radicalism. And that's what distinguishes them from other anti-authoritarians. And that's why they justify this label, in my view. So the central, if you like, the central radicalist charge against an industrial, capitalist, statist, modern society is that it eats away at organic social form. And Martin Buber said, at whatever point we examine a structurally rich society, we find the cell tissue society, and note the use of the organic metaphor there, the cell tissue society everywhere, i.e. a living and life-giving consociation of human beings shaping and reshaping from within. Note that word from within as well. Society is naturally composed not of individuals but of associative units and the associations between them. under capitalist economy and the state peculiar to it, the constitution of society was continually being hollowed out, so that the modern individualizing process finished up as a process of atomization. So this hollowing out process, the radical holists argued, compromised the abilities of communities to be self-managing and autonomous, and contended that and they all contended that new organic social forms were needed. As Murray Bookchin said, "We're travelling the full circle of history. We're taking up again the problems of a new organic society on a new level of historical and technological development. An organic society in which the splits within society, between society and nature, and within the human psyche that were created by thousands of years of hierarchical development can be healed and transcended." But while the radical holists were clear that society has lost its organic structure and that this must be recovered somehow if we're to address our many crises, they've been less than clear about what this meant at the level of everyday life. And they really left that questions like these hanging and never really adequately answered. What is the organic framework within which everyday life will be lived in a sustainable society? How would holism be embedded into everyday life? Why would everyday life that was organised holistically necessarily be non-authoritarian, participatory and decentralist? How would holistically organised everyday life address the multiple interconnected social, ecological, political, economic and cultural issues that we have to deal with? So if our crisis has developed at the level of the everyday life, we have to find some kinds of answers to these questions. Well, holism is it's a complex and evolving body of thought that I can't do justice to here, but I just want to pull out several key principles that have emerged. The first one of these is the principle of interdependence. Everything within a whole affects everything else. We know this now, even though we don't pay any attention to it. It's an image of an interconnected ecosystem there. Self-organisation. The behaviour of a whole. The behaviour of a whole is self-determined and organisationally independent of external forces. Emergence. Order within a whole arises spontaneously and unpredictably. And holarchy. So wholes in the natural world are organised into these kinds of extensive nested structures. Systems at the micro level are numerous and relatively simple: atoms, cells, organisms, molecules and so on. And then as you move out, they become fewer but more complex: ecosystems, biomes, galaxies and so on. So those are some of the principles of holism, but a much more difficult question to answer, and we need to have some grasp of it, is what is wholeness? What is a whole, and how a whole and part appropriately related? That question, that has been a massively important question, never mind in science, but in the whole Western socio-political tradition, the relationship of society to the individual. And the answers that various people have found to that question have had massive consequences on the way society is organised. To give you an extreme example, in Nazi Germany, holism was explicitly drawn on to justify the domination of the Nazi state over its individuals and communities. So very often holism has ended up in these authoritarian or conservative ideologies. So it's something that needs to be defined very clearly, and we need to be clear why it's essentially, in my view, not an authoritarian, doesn't lead to authoritarian social and political forms. So we usually think of a whole and its parts as separate and independent entities. Either the parts are seen as prior to the whole, in which case you have part plus part plus part plus part equals the whole. So the whole becomes an assemblage of separate parts. This is the reductionist way of thinking, essentially. Or, and this is what usually passes for holism, the whole is seen as prior to the parts, in which case the parts are subordinate to the whole. And I've already alluded to the dangerous social and political consequences of that idea. So physicist and philosopher Henry Bortoft, in his, I can't recommend this book too highly. It's absolutely central to the whole understanding of understanding of what wholeness is. It's his account of wholeness is largely inspired by the philosopher and the poet and scientist Wolfgang Goethe, but also he draws on contemporary insights into how holograms work and hermeneutics and phenomenology. Anyway, Bortoft has explored the anatomy of wholeness and calls both of the previous examples that I gave of wholes as counterfeit wholes. So in a counterfeit whole, the parts are not intrinsically related to each other. And as an authentic whole, and I'll describe what authentic wholes are in a minute more, the parts are intrinsically related, and they each reveal a different aspect of the whole. In a counterfeit whole, the unity has to be imposed externally because the parts aren't related. So in an authentic whole, the unity arises through the participation of the parts in the whole. In a counterfeit whole, either the whole or parts dominate. In an authentic whole, whole and part are mutually constituted and reciprocal. In the way mainstream biology tends to perceive wholes in nature in a way that could be described as counterfeit. Or organisms or ecosystems, for example, are not much more than random assemblages of not intrinsically related parts. There is, or if you like, not meaningfully connected parts. So fundamental to Bortoft's concept of wholeness is the dynamic and temporal nature of wholeness. Wholes are always in the present process of becoming, and they arise with and through the multiple expression of the parts. Another way to put it is that if a whole is authentic, its unity expresses as a multiplicity in its parts. We can always see something of the whole within the part. I don't suppose there's a glass of water anywhere. Thanks. So, to take a very where am I? Okay. To take a very simple example, the plant. This kind of reasoning can be applied to anything in the natural world and to even to families of organisms, but I haven't got that much time. So, if you can see this multiplicity and unity which exists in the authentic whole, which is the plant. The separate organs, the different leaves, the flower, the stamen, and so on, reveal different aspects of the whole plant as it comes into being over time. The organs are diverse but related through their participation in the plant of the whole. You can't speak of the whole plant without reference to the separate diverse organs through which the whole plant comes into being over time. So even though there's a diversity of organs or parts, the plant is an intimately related unity or whole. But our habitual mode of seeing causes us to externally impose unity based upon perceived patterns of similarity, and in doing so we miss the underlying unity that's the authentic whole. As I understand it, that's how I'm sticking my neck out a bit here, but that's how the Linnaean system of plant classification works. So we think of unity or wholeness by stripping the parts to what they have down the parts to what they have in common, and the counterfeit wholeness therefore gives gives rise to homogeneity rather than allowing for diversity. So there's a lot of very big ideas in there, and it can take a long time to really get into. But I think the most important concept, or perhaps the most important concept to take away from this understanding of authentic wholeness, is that diversity or multiplicity is an intrinsic character of wholeness. Whereas the way we most often think of wholeness is by creating, by homogenizing in order to create a unity. But the unity is already there. We just don't see it in the plant. So now, coming back to social forms. What bearing do all these principles of holism, self-organisation, interdependence, emergence, holarchy, and authentic wholeness, of the creative relationship between the whole and the part, what bearing do all of those principles have on the creation of a sustainable society? How does wholeness in everyday life lead to a sustainable society? Well, I would argue that we can begin to get a sense of this by looking at pre-industrial traditional communities. So I should throw in a caveat that I don't necessarily want to romanticize or idealize such communities. They had their problems. They had, had their stratifications based on gender, economic inequalities. They were insular. They were conservative, and so on and so on. We know that, and I'm about to make some broad generalizations in what I'm going to say, but especially compared to our own society, I'd argue that these holistic principles were embedded into many aspects of everyday life in traditional communities. And that fact, and I should emphasize this, that fact that those holistic principles were embedded in the everyday life of traditional communities accounts for their ability to flourish over many generations, i.e. to be sustainable. So if we look at some of these images, work that represent work, leisure, festivals, the political systems from within traditional pre-industrial communities. You can see that all of those processes were to a great extent organisationally independent of any external factors. In other words, however imperfect these communities may have been internally, they were somewhat self-organising. And in as far as they were self-organising, these communities and the physical structures within them could be said to be emergent. They arose out. There were no external dictates, design, blueprint, management brought the many facets of everyday life into being. And the reason that they were relatively, compared to our own, self-organising and emergent, was because the relationships or the interdependencies of which they were comprised, the relationships between people and the natural world, between people and their artefacts and their buildings, the relationships were tight and mutually influential. In other words, all these components of everyday life were interdependent. You can also see that just as natural or living systems are nested or holarchic, that is organised at different levels of scale, so too was life in traditional communities. And this nested structure of traditional communities gave rise to clearly defined levels of scale at which everyday life was lived, and within at which communities satisfied their needs. So we can still see these levels of scale at work in our own in modern times, but they don't function as robust or they're not functionally robust. I'll come back to that. So Can everyday life in such communities that are self-organising, emergent and interdependent, can it be described as authentically whole in the same way that the flowering plant was? Is a whole or an invisible whole being expressed through the visible parts, the people, their buildings and so on, their artefacts? And what would it mean to say for a whole community that its parts are diverse expressions of an invisible whole in which they participate and which they bring into being? So there's a danger in this line of thinking, at least in historical times, communities haven't been unities in the same way that an organic form like the plant is. There was always, or usually, to a greater or lesser extent, hierarchy and stratification. Nevertheless, I'd argue that in most industrial